Welcome to the Initiative One Leadership Podcast, where we help leaders maximize their impact and transform their lives. I'm your host, Nick Nyber, as well as the VP of Strategic Partnership with Initiative One. And we have our very own Dr. Fred Johnson, the CEO and founder of Initiative One, on our show here today. And what we're going to be talking about today in this episode is the thought process of telling ourselves the story or creating a narrative in our lives that aren't really making the impact that we want to make, and where this all stems. And we're gonna go ahead. We're gonna get into the conversation here right away. This is something that Dr. Fred and I, as well as the whole team, we've been talking about this last week or two, and it's been really great hearing from the other partners here, right here at Initiative One, and where this all stems from is it stems from a conversation that I was having with Dr. Fred just a couple weeks ago. And we were actually talking about this podcast. And I had some ideas to share with him and Tracy. And Dr. Fred, he asked me a question. He said, "Nick, why are you asking me this? Like, I trust you. You can do a good job." And what happened within that next day is Dr. Fred gave me a call, and he heard this narrative. He heard this story that I was telling myself, which I was completely unaware of, just because what happens in our lives. We work with others, we share what we know, but we're in our own picture frame. Like we can never look outside of our picture frame. That's the power of coaching, is when people can ask you questions that you can't ask yourself. So he had heard me tell a story to myself that I had no clue what was going on. And I'm going to have you go ahead and let's dig right into this, and then we'll get a little bit more into the topic. Can you touch a little bit more about that conversation, Dr. Fred?
Well, I remember I said to you, you came to me like asking for permission, what was a core responsibility of your own of your own job. And I looked at you and I said, why are you asking me this? I trust you. You don't need to come and talk to me about this. Go for it. And then you made this comment. Fred, I was a private in the Army, and I didn't do anything without asking for permission. And you said, I'm Private Nyber. And it caught me. And one of the things that it caught me is that, one, you didn't end up as a private in the Army.
No, I did not.
You had a very successful career in the military. I mean, you can tell the audience in just a few moments what responsibilities that you are a logistical guru. And so little Private Nyber, I immediately sense that's your little guy. That's your narrative, your self-limiting narrative that you've been giving yourself all of your life. Whenever you're about to go into a place of discomfort or a new challenge, something that success is not guaranteed, and that's your message. I'm Private Nyber, and I challenged you that we didn't hire Private Nyber. Now, Private Nyber took care of you for a long time. But we want the adult Nick. We want Big Nick, not Private Nyber. And I think it was a game changer for you.
Yes, it really was. And the value that I got out of that conversation, and you have spoke on this during the think tanks, is you've brought up little Freddie. And this was a think tank that it might have been a year, maybe even 2 years ago, that you had talked about this. But what really got my attention was, like, you labeled it for yourself, and I knew I had the thought process, but it was never really labeled. So you can't adjust something that you can't identify or label, and that's what you did for me. And if you're listening to this, this is not a very, very comfortable topic for me to talk about, because we all have a story. We all have a narrative that we've told ourselves just from life happening, whether it's how we grew up, maybe it's a former employer, maybe it's a business failure, things that we tell ourselves, and a lot of times they're not true. They're not true. They're opinions, they're feelings, but they're not facts. And Dr. Fred, you had talked about my background in the military, and when we had talked as a team the week previous, I did go back. I spent 8 years in the military. I was running these 75 to 100 vehicle convoys in and out of Iraq in 2004 and 2005. Um, they probably wouldn't give that kind of responsibility to an E1 private. They're probably going to give it to someone that does have confidence and competence and character and the ability to, successfully complete a mission. So I want to thank you, Dr. Fred, for labeling that for me, because now I can go back and identify when Private Nyber shows up. Uh, you speak about 2.7 and 8.0. Can you share with us the thought process between a 2.7 and an 8.0?
Sure. So one of the things that we know is that there are two sources of information that guide how we regard ourselves. You've heard me say there's always two agendas. There's the over the table agenda, there's the under the table agenda, and the under the table agenda, when it collides with the over, always has the greatest power. And we've all been taught various lessons in order to be an effective leader. And let's say I am performing very, very well, and people are complimenting me. They're saying you're doing excellent work. You're making progress. You're creating momentum. I would call that your 8.0. 8.0 is when you are using behaviors that are effective, that are attracting people to you, not pushing people away. They're not self-destructive. They're actually creating positive momentum in your life. An 8.0 behavior, for instance, would be receiving accountability as a gift. And a 2.7 behavior is seeing accountability as a threat. And that you're actually exposing me by having a conversation about my performance. 8.0 leaders hire leaders that are smarter, more gifted, more capable than they are. And they're really excited about that. At 2.7, I'm going to hire the weakest people that I can find to make sure that I can control them, that they don't push me back, that they don't push back on me, that they don't, that I can take credit for. And so those are 2.7 behaviors. And what we know is that cognitive dissonance teaches that the above the table stories that we tell ourselves, that we've learned, that we keep conscious, that happens 5 days a week, 8 to 10 hours a day. And we're very aware of those messages that as a leader, I've got to create a safe environment. As a leader, I've got to be casting vision all the time. As a leader, I've got to be listening deeply to people to show respect. I've got to make sure that when people hold me accountable, that I don't get defensive. All of those are conscious 8.0 behaviors that I've learned from other people. But your 2.7 is subconscious. And we know that 99.8% of every thought that the brain has is subconscious. We don't even know it's happening. And so 100% of the time, 5 days a week, 24 hours a day. Our brain, the average leader, the average adult in America, from a scale of 0 to 10, has a self belief level of 2.7. That's where we say, get this term 2.7. And at 2.7, I really believe I'm a fraud. And my whole life is spent trying to keep people at a distance so that they don't ever find me out, so that they don't ever learn what I believe is the truth about myself. 2.7 will not be vulnerable. 2.7 will never admit a mistake. 2.7 will never take a risk by being authentic and sharing our story with other people. And so 2.7 always keeps people at a distance. Well, you can't be a leader in today's culture and keep people at a distance. And so that so those 2.7 behaviors were learned at an earlier point in our lives, and they're often learned during childhood. And those are behaviors that we used as kids to actually keep us safe or to have control over an environment where other adults were present, that we didn't have control over them. And those are behaviors that work for us as kids, but as adults, they begin to actually backfire against us. And 2.7 behaviors, they make me feel safe, but they actually make everybody else feel disrespected or unsafe. And it begins to sabotage my ability as a leader. It begins to sabotage my relationships. It begins to sabotage my ability to have healthy relationships with other people, whether it's my family, whether it's at work, cohorts, and so forth. And so we spent a lot of time talking about how the key to leadership, far more than talent, far more than experience, far more than skill sets. It's really getting a handle on those narratives and changing our self narrative about ourselves. That is the game changer that can actually transform a leader and how they behave, and therefore the results they get by those changed behaviors.
So an 8.0, just as like a review, is so the 8.0 to me sounds like you're showing up as your best self. You're showing up as your true self. When someone's delivering information to you, you're accepting that information. You're not digging your heels in. You're hearing it. You're digesting that information. You're seeing how, and not just receiving information, but just showing up every day as your best self. Is 2.7. You are not your best self. You're telling yourself a narrative. There's all these, it's not even like one story. It's like all these different, all the different stories that have happened to us or me my whole life. And then that's impacting how I show up on a daily basis. So
and our 2.7 self, Nick, typically shows up in environments where we feel disrespected, in environments where we don't feel heard, included, in environments where we don't feel valued as human beings. And so, for instance, in a top-down work environment where I am reporting to someone who says, I don't care what you think, just do what I told you to do, I'm going to instantly feel disrespected. Because if you don't want to hear what I have to say, what in today's culture, we interpret that as you really don't want to hear, you don't value me. And so we know that if a person has an internal narrative of 2.7, or that I'm not enough, or I'm a fraud, or I'm an imposter, they're always living that. So any kind of disrespectful environment can bring that out, that behavior out in a nanosecond. I remember I was 38 years old before I even knew this concept really even existed. Even though I was a psychology major, I was a specialist in marriage and family therapy. And I remember I was leading a major organization in Detroit, and things had fallen apart. And I had a team that didn't respect me, a team that was afraid of me, a team that wouldn't tell me the truth. In fact, whenever a new person was hired to our team, I didn't know it at the time, but they were already going to that new person and coaching them. Look, you need to know that Fred he's a great guy, except if you ever are critical of him, even if it's justified, he will absolutely shut you down. And the way he'll shut you down, and my staff had a term for it, the iron curtain will come down. He doesn't
Wow.
get mad. He doesn't get angry. He just goes away. And you are not going to be a part of his inner circle. You just need to know that. So I had an entire team that did not feel safe to tell me the truth. And we had all kinds of issues bubbling under the surface, and I had no clue to it. And eventually, they bubbled enough that they blew up. And that was about 30 years ago. I'll never forget that time in my life. So I went to a friend of mine who was a therapist, and he said to me, he said, how does it feel that 90% of the time you have been going to work, you have been showing up as little Freddie? And I said, little Freddie, what are you talking about? He said, that's your child self. That's your child side
Wow.
that shows up when you don't feel respected. And Fred, you were taught by your dad, you better be perfect. Your dad was a flaming perfectionist. He knew me very well, this gentleman. And he said, if you made a mistake, you know there was hell to pay with your dad. And I said, you're right. And he said, so you had a narrative that my value comes from doing everything perfectly. So when someone would criticize me, I would take that personally every time and equate it to, therefore, I'm not enough. And I would get defensive. And I developed modes of how to stay safe when someone wanted to criticize me, and I would just go away from them. And I had no idea. And he said, you've been in Freddie for 90% of your adult life, and you don't even know he's around. And man, it was the beginning of a journey to really begin to understand how I sabotaged myself all the time and had no clue. And the fact is, we all have this side. And if we're not aware of that side is going to dominate us even all the time, and we don't even know it. And it does not create positive momentum in our lives as leaders. It doesn't, it continues. That's the side that we're always shooting ourselves in the foot. And one of the things we know about effective leadership is just not shooting yourself in the foot and showing up creates momentum, because you're not starting over. Sorry, my lights just went out. And you're not starting over all the time. So this whole idea of changing your narrative, our process actually helps a person in the folks that we deal with, because we tend to deal with cream of the crop leaders who have a higher level of self-belief. Our research has shown over the years that their self-belief level is actually a 4, which isn't something to write home to mama about. And because you've got to get your self-belief level to somewhere around a 7 or 8 before you start seeing these healthy behaviors in our lives that create trust with other people begin to happen. And we saw in our process that the average self-belief level goes from 4 to a 7 in about a 4-month period. And it's really about learning new tools to challenge the fraudulent narrative that you tell yourself all the time that's not true. and begin to replace it with a narrative that's healthy and is truthful and is positive, and it creates powerful results in our lives.
So I'm hearing you. I'm hearing two different things here. Number one, us as individuals showing up, whether it's 2.7, 8.0, and building towards that 8.0. But then there's also the whole aspect of people that are listening and watching this right now. There are people that they're responsible for. They're leading a team of people. So if I, the leader, am a 2.7, to expect an 8.0 from anyone from that team is completely unfair.
It's
That
not going
just
to happen.
it's just it is not going to happen. And it's not, I guess here's my next question. What's step one? I want my team to be an 8.0 and I want to be an 8.0. Where does it start?
Well, it always starts with the leader. I was watching an NFL game between the Packers and the Bucks yesterday, and I noticed the announcer said something. He was talking about Tom Brady and why he's such a great leader, and evidently this gentleman had played with Brady, and he made this comment that one of the things that makes Brady great is Brady always points the finger at himself first when something doesn't go right. And he said that became part of the New England Patriot way, that when we made a mistake, instead of pointing the finger at everybody else, we always look at ourselves inwardly first. And even if we weren't the ones that created the mistake, we go, how could I do different? What could I do differently the next time to possibly prevent that mistake from happening elsewhere? And so the answer to your question, it always starts with self-awareness first, and recognizing that we all have those negative narratives, those self-destructive messages that we give ourselves every day. You know, I tell people, no one came out of the womb ever saying that I'm not enough. No one ever came out of the womb saying, you know what? I'm a loser. I hope people don't find me out. I hope people don't know my self-doubt. I hope people don't ever find out my story. I'm a 2.7. No one ever came out of the womb with that.
Right.
You see, all of that is a message that we learned and accepted along the way. And so it's the same process that formed that message that you have to use to unform that message. And so we tell people all the time, you have to make a decision or a choice to accept the fact that you're enough. And then your messaging has to reflect that all the time. I put sticky notes on my mirrors. I am constantly reminding myself, I'm enough. I can do this. If I fail, it doesn't mean I'm a failure. If I make a mistake, it doesn't mean that I am a mistake. It's an opportunity for learning. And so the messages that we tell ourselves over and over and over eventually begin to change how we regard ourselves, the same way that we were was created. And you asked me earlier, what forms those message systems? Well, basically, there are three things that form those message systems about ourselves. Number one is the family that we grew up with.
Okay.
And the messages that family system taught us, that often they don't even know that they taught us that, and we don't even know we learned it. And so, for instance, my dad did not mean to teach me perfectionism as the root of my identity. And I didn't even know until I was an adult that had become a root of a part of my core identity. And so the messages that we get from our family systems are a key source of our self narratives. The second one is critical events that happen in our lives. They can be negative, but most of the time they're traumatic. And we call them impact moments. A loss of a loved one, a sickness, an illness, a traumatic event, your parents getting divorced. And those are messages from our events that begin to shape our reality for the rest of our lives. Um, um, and then the third is messages that we receive from mentors, coaches, clergy, our counselors at school, neighbors in our neighborhood, people outside of our immediate family, things that they said to us about us that we internalized. I'll never forget. My wife was told by her high school counselor that you will never make it out of college and don't even try. You're not college material.
Wow.
And it actually backfired because she was so determined to prove this guy wrong. She ended up getting 4.0 in both her bachelor's and her master's in business. She raised 3 kids. Now between us, 5 kids, who really are some of the smartest kids I've ever seen, and they came from mama's DNA, and so and that's been over 40 years ago, and we still drive by that counselor's house every
Hmm.
day on the way to our house from work to our home. We pass that guy's house, and she still at times will relate that story, and so those messages linger for decades, for the rest of our lives. So those are typically the 3 things that form our self narratives: mentors, uh, significant events in our lives that begin to be part of our filter system, and then messages that we receive from our family of origin, especially our parents or parental figures.
And you had talked about you were in your late 30s when you just realized for the first time you were showing up as this person. That whole time, you had those turning points, you had those critical events. You were raised in a certain way. You responded the way that you were treated. That's what created your story, as well as everyone else on the outside in receiving information. So everyone that's watching this, everyone that's listening to this, we've all experienced this, haven't we? We've all had people in our lives that have told us something and we've taken it as gospel. That is the truth. Well, guess what? They could be wrong.
Nick, it's so funny. I've got a bank president friend that his team went through our process. And one day he let his guard down and he called his first name. Let's say it's Bill. It wasn't Bill. But he said, I have a narrative. And my narrative is I am Bill from Gillett. Now, if you know anything about Gillett, Wisconsin, it's a little tiny, tiny town out in the middle of nowhere. And he was constantly telling himself, how in the world did I ever get a bank president? I have no idea. I don't belong in this office. Does the board really know that I'm only this big? That's what he was telling himself all the time. We have another person on our team. And he will tell himself, I'm Philip. Notice Philip, his name's Phil, but Philip was the name that his mom and dad always called him when he was in trouble. And he said, I've had some pretty significant positions. And yet every time I'm hired to a new position, I'm going, how do they understand that they're hiring Philip from Medford, which is another little town out in the middle of nowhere in Wisconsin?
Mhm.
And he said, I've been fighting that all my life, that message system. And so whenever I get into a position that requires high responsibility, I always start off by thinking I'm already over my head, that I'm already digging from a hole, from a place of weakness instead of a place of strength. And he said one of the major turnarounds for his career was when he really went from a position of I'm not enough to declaring and accepting over time that I am enough. And that's a transition, by the way, that never stops.
Always working on that. And I remember you talking about that when you had shared with the audience, like, I got some really good news on this topic. You get to experience this every day.
Yeah.
So, and it doesn't matter. It can be someone that's just out of college. It could be the CEO of a multi-million-dollar company. It doesn't matter. Like, we all have those doubts. We all have those fears. We all have those stories and the narratives. The solution, or at least the step forward, is I'm thinking is awareness. Being aware, is that right? Just really being aware of yourself and how
Yeah.
you're showing up.
You know, Nick, there will be people who possibly will be hearing this message, this podcast, and they'll going, you know, what a bunch of BS. You know, what a bunch of soft stuff. This is so soft. If that's their reaction, they're already in trouble and they don't even know it.
Mhm.
And so if you deny or don't even want to really begin to get your arms around this issue for your own leadership, that already tells me that you have a ceiling that you probably have already hit. The leaders who keep getting better and better and better are the ones who become aware of the messages that they're giving themselves, in which they cause themselves to shoot themselves in the foot. You know, let me tell you how it played out for me. When you don't think you're enough, you think it's only a matter of time before people start finding you out. And so I was a pastor for many years, and I served 4 different congregations. And the first 3, I left within 4 years, very short stints. And here's why. If someone got mad at me, and when you're a pastor of a congregation, there's always someone mad at you. I
Mhm.
started going, okay, here it goes. It's the end is starting. And so when people found out I wasn't perfect, and when people would start getting disappointed in decisions that I made or something that I didn't meet their expectations, I started looking for the door. Because it was only a matter of time where enough of them would figure me out that they would, quote, fire me. And by golly, I'm going to leave before I get fired. I'm going to leave on my terms. And I kept starting over. And I had this company, even though I formed it 23 years ago, it took us for 18 years to really experience really significant growth. And you know why? Because that same pattern I was playing out every 3 years. But here's how it worked. I would have 100% turnover every 3 years. Now, I had the people skills to always replace those people. But I would always go, you know, it's once again, I didn't find the right person. Once again, they don't have the level of commitment that they need to, or they don't get it. It was always about them. But it was how I was playing it, that narrative out, that I would basically run people off about every 3 years, um, before they, quote, ran me off. Same narrative. And I had a friend of mine, when we started experiencing really significant growth, he pointed out a pattern. He said, Fred, do you know why you're growing? And I said, well, I think so. And he said, well, I don't think you do. The biggest reason why you're growing is, for the first time, you broke a pattern. You see, you thought you were an 18-year-old company, but you were a 3-year-old company that had done it 6 different times. And you never broke through to a place of deeper learning and a place of deeper complexity. And as I began to work on myself in a much greater way, that pattern of not checking out and looking for the door every 3 years, and how it was playing itself out, it stopped playing itself out for me. And we started creating momentum instead of having to start over, and recreate the wheel. And that's many of us. We don't create momentum. We keep starting over because we keep we keep playing out patterns. We keep shooting ourselves in the foot, and we don't build those little wins. over and over and over until it becomes a major trajectory.
That's really interesting that was happening in your company for that many years and you hadn't seen the trend. I think that goes
And
hand
I
in-
was, quote, an expert in leadership.
Yes, yes. So you were in your late 30s when you started realizing like, wow, like this has been showing up. And then a few years later, you're realizing not the same thing, but just different stories and narratives that were in your life that were affecting your company growth. It's so interesting that we can just go about our days and speak with people, work with people, give value to people, do what we're doing in our careers. And there's all this whole story that's going on. We don't even know what's even going on. And that's the gift that we get to give to organizations and leaders to help them see the story. And you know what? The people that are listening to this right now, it's okay to be a leader with a limp.
Well, in fact, the leaders that I know that I have the most respect for are the ones that own their limp. Their areas of vulnerability and imperfection, and their areas of failure, and their areas where they had to get back up after a major loss in their life. Um, I've often said we're all misfit toys. We all in a way are screw ups. And the irony is the people who are the healthiest leaders are the ones who recognize and own the fact of how screwed up we are. And in a crazy way, that's a sign of health, of understanding that none of us have our act together. And when we quit trying to prove ourselves to everyone else and start accept that, we call that living by declaration, not desperation. That is a mindset that starts attracting people to us, because people are really desperate to be around people who allow them to take their masks off and allow them to be who they are without judgment and without any kind of you don't measure up kind of message. And so I have found that when leaders become at peace with themselves, they become magnets for other people who are seeking that same peace for their lives.
I love that. That's really, really good. Thank you for sharing today, Dr. Fred. Any closing comments on the topic of the narrative and the story that we tell ourselves?
Yeah, it's a never ending quest. As I told you, it took 15 years later, I'm still learning new layers of that onion that still need to be peeled back. And so if you have the courage to confront yourself and to begin to search yourself, most people won't do that because they're afraid of finding out. When they find out, they assume it's going to be negative. We challenge people, give yourself a break and assume the fact that you've got surprising discoveries about yourself and how significant and how wonderful you are as a person that you are not realizing is waiting for you to discover. And so I just want to say to each of you, the mark of leadership is continual self-awareness, continual self-discovery, as we learn those messages about ourselves to help us to become the best version of ourselves as people and as leaders.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And if you are listening to this or watching this episode for the first time, this is our question for you. Our goal at Initiative One is to impact thousands of people. And how we do that is by sharing this information that we just shared today. You take this podcast episode, you take this YouTube video, share it with a family member, share it with a colleague, share it with a friend. If this impacted you, chances are very high it's going to impact someone that you know as well. So our question is, go ahead, share this with someone else. Also, we put out these podcasts at least once a week, a couple times a month for sure. Go ahead and subscribe to our YouTube channel, subscribe to our podcast. That way you're not missing any episodes that come out in the future. One of the best ways that people can make an impact in their lives is by consuming new information, the information that we share on a monthly basis through some of our leadership events that we put on as an organization. If you've not yet been to our website, go to initiative1.com and click on Leadership Think Tanks and subscribe. Go ahead and register for our next event. We would love to have you join us in the conversation. It's not just a speech that we put on. It's a dialogue. It's a conversation. We want to get your thoughts so we can all grow and get better together. Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Fred, for joining us here today, and we'll see you on the next episode.
Thank you, Nick.